Let's go live to Lismore now, and I'm joined by the Nationals Senator and Shadow Infrastructure Minister Bridget McKenzie. What's the feedback you've been receiving? Obviously still the trauma very real for residents of the Northern Rivers.
Yeah, Kieran, it's great to be back in Lismore, and I think listening to that package earlier, it really does reflect both some of the challenges of the long-term recovery, and that particularly that rollout of the buyback program hasn't been quick enough. But similarly, as I checked into my hotel today, smiles on locals' faces. The town centre looks a lot better than it did when I was here 12 months ago. And there's a real sense of positivity and can-do. And tonight we're gathering at the Turf Club, as soon as I leave you, to really celebrate that tinny army, 300-odd locals who jumped into their boats and spent the night rescuing their fellow citizens in what I think was just such an amazing example of resilience and courage. And we're gathering at the Turf Club to celebrate them, and then obviously at 6 o'clock tonight we'll be holding a memorial service.
The federal government announced the first tranche of its $150 million mitigation efforts in the Northern Rivers. That was last week. Are you comfortable with where their focus is at the moment? I think it was about $50 million on various mitigation measures. But really, from what I've read about the Northern Rivers and the crisis, was that the river gauges, the rain gauges in the region, they need to be upgraded, and we need a much more streamlined approach rather than 4 different agencies having control of these facilities.
Yeah, look, Kieran, I stood here with the local member, Nationals Kevin Hogan, and made an announcement as Emergency Management Minister of $150 million out of the Emergency Management Fund that was going to go to flood mitigation projects here in the Northern Rivers and the LGAs surrounding it. Now, what I understand from the Labor government's announcement last week is that money's going to be spread right around 26 local government areas, not focused here, where the magnitude of the event was such that we hadn't seen anything like it in this country in recorded times. So I would like to see hard infrastructure to protect these communities going forward, and I don't think what the Labor government has announced thus far is enough. And I'll be speaking to locals, obviously, on the ground here today and tomorrow to hear their direct feedback.
And on the Northern Rivers itself, I asked the Minister last week. He said there might be some houses in some streets that need to be relocated. What's your view? Because there are large parts of Lismore, as you know, and elsewhere in the Northern Rivers that are quite susceptible on floodplains and so on. What's your read on whether people will have to relocate?
Well, at the end of the day, Kieran, that is always going to be a matter for individuals and their families. You look at a place like Gympie, in that flooding event last year that started in Queensland, they've built in those areas in a manner and using materials that means they can very quickly and easily clean up from flooding events. We have to probably get into perspective that the flooding event we saw here 12 months ago was, in some cases being quoted as a 1 in 500 year event. So we would be unlikely to see a repeat of that, in any of our lifetimes. But it's how we rebuild, the materials we use to rebuild, and where we rebuild. And that's why having the programs that Kevin fought for, like the buyback scheme, are available to locals so that they actually have choices about whether they stay locally, or whether they end up making their home elsewhere. We want people to be living in rural and regional communities, and that often means you have to bear the brunt of the elements and natural disasters more keenly than you would in a capital city. But I believe we can, using technology, using smart design and planning laws, get the balance right to make sure communities like Lismore and the broader Northern Rivers survive and thrive going forward.
The Prime Minister and Treasurer announced the change to superannuation for those with balances of over $3 million, that the concessional tax rate in the earnings phase would go from 15% tax to 30% in that earnings phase for funds over $3 million or balances over $3 million. the Prime Minister says it's going to start as of 25, 26. So after the next federal election, given they're going to go to an election before it comes into force, does that protect them from claims of a broken promise?
Oh, absolutely not, Kieran. I thought yours and Clonell's discussion was incredibly insightful and on point. You know, you could barely find the Labor Party prepared to commit to anything during the federal election campaign as they snuck in to government. But the one thing they were very clear about, they weren't going to be making changes to superannuation. They weren't going to be jacking up taxes. So they've done this. What else are they going to do? Is negative gearing going to be back on the table? I mean, they've gone from one election campaign where they refuse to say what they're going to do when they come into government, that's such a small target, to now, you know, 2.5 years out, they're going to implement these super changes. I think you're really seeing here the tension between the current Prime Minister and the aspirant Prime Minister in Jim Chalmers, and having to that tension within the Labor Party about their values and their principles, and are they really serious about budget repair? I'm concerned about negative gearing, about death duties, etc., and that list of $150 billion of other taxes that Treasury wants to get their mitts on. What's going to be next? What's the next balloon, I think, that Jim Chalmers is going to float, that Anthony Albanese will be wedged into having to accept? When you've actually taken the time in this country to work hard, have your wages compulsorily acquired and stuffed into superannuation until you retire, I mean, the government needs to treat those investment decisions with respect and make sure this isn't retrospective, which I think is really disappointing in the announcement today.
Shadow Infrastructure Minister Bridget McKenzie joining me live from Lismore. Thanks. Talk to you soon.
See you, Kieran.